Hello, friends. Welcome to the Legend Fiction Show. I'm Dominic, founder of Legend Fiction. I am very pleased to be joined by David Bentley Hart. He is a Eastern Orthodox, is it philosopher and theologian with a rash of books to his name, and everybody loves having him on for all sorts.
I start with the word writer, and
Writer?
well, just because I'm trying to, sell more of the fiction.
All right. I'll
So
start again. We'll go with that then.
Oh, okay. No. This is part of the interview. I'm being facetious. You say.
Oh, I see.
You don't have to accommodate me. This is a nice informality to it.
So I have read a bunch of your books, but one book that I have not seen enough people hear about is the fact that you wrote a book of fiction. And since we're a fiction-loving writing community, kind of run by Catholic and Orthodox people,
I've written 7 books of fiction, but you mean the one in particular?
One specifically being Kenogaia, which was not a collection of stories, but an actual foray into an imaginal, an entire world that you ended up that you've created called Kenogaia. It was published 2.5 years ago now, I think.
Oh, I think it's more like 3. Time goes by fast.
For those who have never heard of the book, this is conversation that is not going to reveal any of the ending or anything, but I do want to talk about some of the themes, some of your own inspirations that went into it. You have called it a Gnostic fairy tale, and I'm very interested in that as a discipline or as a group of they were also Christians or members of the early church, and then anyhow, I'd like to understand more about that. I'd like to talk about imagination with you, and maybe we'll end with dragons, because dragons are a big deal for our community, and we just need to clear a heck of a lot of the air around what they are and why they matter.
A lot of us are pet lovers, so I understand.
A lot of us are what?
Pet lovers. Yeah. I'm assuming that pet dragons are part. I love those adorable online dragon videos, bouncing on trampolines, playing with keyboards.
Okay, see, I've not seen those. I've not seen that.
You might be a little too literal-minded for me. I'm not aware of any such videos, really. I was making a joke about cat video. It was ponderous. It was a ponderous joke. I retract.
Well, we do use a lot of dragons in thinking and talking about stuff with legend fiction, partly because I think that if you absolutely can't stand them, you probably haven't read enough stories, and you probably don't know enough about mythology and how they're used, or what they mean. But let's come back to Kenogaia. You created this. It's an entire world, and it gave me, especially initially, very strong sense of kind of like The Horse and His Boy. There's a bit of a Narnia sense of a rediscovery of a world that is wilder than you thought it was, and it feels also like George MacDonald in the sense of it's a very deep kind of, I don't know, there aren't any novels that I know of that are written today like this, and I'm so glad that you've created one. Who would you credit, or what were your literary inspirations going into it?
Well, I would say that George MacDonald definitely was there in the background. I don't really tend to think in terms of inspirations. I mean, Antoine de Saint-Exupéry, The Little Prince, Le Petit Prince, was actually the jumping off point, because I was thinking, there's a character in it who is vaguely analogous to The Little Prince. Is a Gnostic fantasy, and written in a very specific sort of French/Belgian symbolist vein, and that was influenced by Maurice Maeterlinck and others. But I mean, just the whole world. I mean, you mentioned it already. I mean, I read C.S. Lewis as a boy as well, and I have a mixed feeling about the Narnia books. Some of them I quite like, some not so much. But the truth is, it was an idea that it struck me several years ago, actually, about starting with a conceit like the one in The Little Prince of a descent into a world that, well, you say don't want to give much away about it, but I think we can give away something that, well, at the beginning, much is given away in the beginning, so that a world that is the, if not entirely malign, largely malign creation of a lesser deity, a lesser creator. But I put the idea aside, except that some years ago I was terrifically ill from a mold infection, got my lungs, and had very devastating systemic effects that it took a while to recover from, and I didn't know if I would recover at all. I started writing my way out of the depression occasioned by it, because writing is how I go, and I didn't want to write anything at that point that wasn't just purely fantastic. I was looking for an escape, but an escape nonetheless into a world that was colored by the darkness of my experience. And I wrote the first half of it in about 5 months, and then set it aside because I came to Notre Dame to work on a project in research, and then picked it up again later and wrote the last half of it in 6 months. And what was interesting to me was that picking it up, it just immediately kept flowing. It was as if I had never lost touch with this world. And so the inspiration, in a sense, was just situational. I was seeking an escape by way of my imagination from what was itself a sort of dark, false world of depression in which I was living. But I think George MacDonald probably was the prior influence who either consciously or unconsciously I was turning to.
I'm curious about the George MacDonald, well, tangent, because I remember I read his book Lilith, and then only recently I'd never heard of him. Well, apart from, what was it, The Princess and the Goblin. I read that over and over growing up. But I recently read Lilith, and then the other book.
Fantasties?
Thank you, yes, Fantasties.
Those are the
Because,
two that are usually put together, sort of
yeah,
at the beginning and the end of his fantasizing career.
right. And the Inklings would keep referencing, and I thought, well, let's go read who inspired the Inklings. And then I learned something interesting about Tolkien, who disliked the use of how dreaming and imagination was used, I think, for MacDonald. And so
Yeah.
I've been studying the whole on fairy stories thing for the writing community that I run. I'm curious what you think, because I read through Lilith, and I got all the way to the end, and I thought, this is so much more than just a mere dream sequence.
Yeah,
I thought
no.
this was more like what you did with your book.
It appeals to me at a very deep level. In fact, other things I write, I don't know if you're aware of the other things are not fantasy books, but they have fantastic elements in them. If you were to pick up the recent collection of short stories, I mentioned this earlier to you before we began this, Prisms, Veils, there are dream elements running through the stories, in fact, and fantastic elements that are very close to dreams, or at least oniric in atmosphere. And of course, I wrote recently a very large book, or published recently, I shouldn't say I wrote it recently, a book on philosophy of mind. And in the course of that, I did actually read up quite a lot on the structure of dreams, on lucid dreams, on liminal dreams. There are many different dream states that we experience. And I think I'm superstitious about dreams. I think the intuition of the ancient world, both East and West, from late antiquity or from late antique China and from other places, there are various kinds of dream manuals that, in their way, I think are often, and not as reductive, say, as Freud on dreams. I mean, if what I thought about dreams were Freudian in nature, I would find dreams largely uninteresting. I find much more convincing. I believe, for instance, I've had dreams that were more than just confabulations of my neurons. I think that they were communications, they were revelations. And I definitely, as a young man, on more than one occasion, had dreams of events that later occurred. And I mean, occurred not just in a vaguely similar fashion, but quite literally what I had dreamt simply then happened. Now, this was a very common experience for my father. Had incredibly vivid dreams, and on some occasions he would describe them to us, and then under circumstances that could not possibly have been foreseen, they came true down to the last detail. So I don't think the dreaming state is simply a realm of confusion or of wandering attention. And of course, my favorite books, perhaps of all time, if I were to be perfectly honest, the Alice books, are both dreams. Now, I don't like dreams being used as a way of getting out of
difficult situations.
Yeah, I never watched Dallas, but I understand there was a whole season that turned out to be a dream, so they could bring a character back to life, which is amusing, but also
But cheating.
Yeah, I think it's fair to say that's a cheat, but also there are two wonderful children's books written by John Masefield, the Night People and the Box of Delights, and the latter especially, wonderful fantasies, but they both end with the protagonists waking up. And that I don't like. When I was a kid, I didn't like the end of the film version of of The Wizard of Oz, because it turns out
Agreed. Yeah.
dream, whereas in the books, Oz is a real place. It all
Right.
really happens. And so, yeah, a long answer to a short question. No, I don't share that. In fact,
No,
much the
I don't
opposite.
think it's a short question. Yeah.
And one other thing I'll say is I've always been very, very drawn to that Middle European tradition of somewhat melancholic, absurdist fantasy. I mean, Kafka, Bruno Schulz, Witold Gombrowicz, and you can go on and on and on, which is a kind of approach to writing that's set between the world of concrete daily existence and what you called, well, you said the imaginal realm.
Hmm.
As
Hmm.
makes me think a bit of an Araby when you put it that way. But yeah, and I've always loved that whole literary tradition, that sort of Middle European, frequently Middle European Jewish tradition of absurdist realism, realist absurdism. I don't know what you
Okay.
call
Yeah. I'd like to keep going down this for a moment because it bridges into the realm of imagination as a concept. I've got an article I'm working on right now about what is the perilous realm and how I think it's actually connected to the concept of the imaginal realm, or I think dreaming in some way connects to all of this as well. The realm of the fairy, the realm of fae.
it. Yeah.
Year and a half ago, I stumbled into, what was it called? It was dream yoga. And I realized I have no idea what this means. And so I went to start researching it and found that it's, I guess you could say, moral practice in the state of lucid dreaming. And that's when I began to realize, oh, I thought I knew what lucid dreaming was. Now I don't. What does this mean well, yeah, what does this mean? So I've been down that rabbit hole for the last year and a half.
I'm aware of that. I mean, there is um, a sort of really 18th, 19th century yogic practice that started in India of sort of waking dreaming, inducing an aneric state while
Mm-hmm.
awake. And one of the persons who, again, to return to a sort of obsession of mine, who practiced this, for instance, in later years was Charles Dodgson, Lewis Carroll. And when he wrote the Sylvia and Bruno books, which are a mixed bag, I'll admit. They're, sort of saccharine Victorian sentimentality makes it, but also moments of real genius. But one of the odd influences on those books that was in fact his attempt at that time to practice this discipline of waking dreams. He was a very devout Christian, a universalist. He was like George. In fact, he and George MacDonald were friends, but he too believed that the dream realm was more than just a sort of state of dormant reason, the mind running on when the rational faculties are no longer in control of the spectacle. He thought that there was a spiritual dimension that dreaming is, and that is, so to speak, a causeway between the immanent and the transcendent, or between here below and there above. You may remember. Do you know the Alice books? Because of course
Oh,
they
yes, I
show.
grew up reading them.
Oh
Hmm.
yeah. Well, of course, nothing has been more influential on my imagination in some ways. Something that took hold of it when I was very young is the Red King in Through the Looking Glass, because he appears only in one chapter, and then again in the very last paragraph of the book is mentioned, and he's sleeping. And Tweedledee and Tweedledum tell Alice, "Well, what do you think he's dreaming? He's dreaming about you, And if he were to wake up, you'd go out
Hmm.
like a candle, bang. And she says, "No, I know I'm real. I'm real." She starts crying and says, "How could I not be real if I'm crying?" And I think it's Tweedledum, as it just says to it, "I hope you don't think those are real tears." But at the very end, Alice is talking to the kitten in her lap and saying, "Now, which was it? Or, who dreamt it all? He was in my dream, but I was in his dream."
Yeah.
And the one who dreamt it all, of course, given that Lewis Carroll, as I say, was a very devout Christian, you don't have to doubt
Yes.
who it is he thinks has dreamt it all. But that has enchanted me. I've returned, in fact, in some of those other fictions. In fact, one I'm writing now. The figure of the Red King is a presence who sort of darts in and out of the text.
This topic really, really intrigues me. Have you heard of Robert Moss? Is he a figure that you ever found?
Not that I recall. You'd have
No.
to remind me
Okay.
if I do.
He's I guess a dream practitioner. So he's from Australia. Anyhow, he's written a number of books, and he was somebody that I discovered and
Oh,
started studying.
yeah, I've heard of him, I think. Yes, you
Okay.
say Australia. Yeah, I've never read anything, but yes, I think I've heard of him. Yeah.
Okay. What he's gave me a lot of well, framework for how to rethink about the depth of dreaming. That it can be just the mere night invention and roast beef from last night and stuff, but then there can also be these much greater things. There it can be a practice or something that can be a discipline that can be practiced, and it can also be something that you're just swept away in as things that are presented and prepared for you, within which you field test or grow or learn or things like this. I'm actually curious. You mentioned earlier, this is something I've been really curious about. You talked about the cultures outside of Christianity having very deep and active dreaming disciplines, which would effectively mean that the body goes to sleep, daylight consciousness relaxes, but then the consciousness of the soul just continues to be exercised and practiced and almost in an unbroken stream across the course of a life, and then after death and so on. But this is not so within Christian or Christianity. The whole thing of incubation and going to sleep in let's say sacred places to incubate and invite dreams from holy things from the numinous.
Right.
I
Well,
don't know
it's
that it
of
much.
course one of the of course in the late antique world, I've mentioned this. Of course, was sleeping in the temple of a god or goddess in the hope of receiving a dream.
Right.
And of course, I think this was practiced at places like Delphi even.
Yeah.
And this is a fairly common practice throughout the world in the late antique and more ancient worlds, both east and west. This notion of seeking a dream, but no, it's
The,
not. It's not part of Christianity. In fact, when dreams, I mean, it's not part of the Christian tradition in any major sense.
and I'm curious why. Do you have a sense why it fell off? Or maybe it just, I don't know, seems to have gone underground?
Well, it may have been in part because of its association with the pagan mysteries. It is the case that you have a literature of, say, the Desert Fathers facing temptation. This was the uh, life of Antony, for instance. And there, the images that appear to the ascetic are temptations, demonic fancies, things that come in order to shake Antony's resolve in his singular devotion to prayer and fasting and contemplation of God and the cultivation of
Mhm.
Christian love. And in a sense, this is drawing on a sort of cautionary aspect of the late antique understanding of dreams, which is that they come both true and false, and being able to discriminate between them, whether they're sent by a good demon, but in the not in the later opprobrious sense, but in the sense of a lower intermediate divinity or genius. Genius in Latin is the translation of daemon. But it's also acknowledged in all these traditions that there are dreams that lead astray, that the dreams that mitunt manes, that the ancestors, the manes below, send up, can come through one of two gates. The gate of ivory, the gate of horn. Another story of mine, a very old one that, like the oldest of mine that's actually in print in any book, is called the Ivory Gate for just this reason, And there, the story, again, I don't want to give anything away, but the story is about whether the dream world of this character who is adept at vivid dreaming, for whom it's almost like a special virtuosity that he possesses, is more real than the ordinary experience he has. Because in some sense, whether one takes to an extreme a kind of Kantian representationalist epistemology or just goes with the latest understandings of neuroscience and how the intentionality and the intentional structures of thought construct the world of experience, or if, so you mentioned the Inklings earlier, like Owen Barfield, Saving the Appearances. The world we inhabit, in one way or another, is not simply a set of impressions that we receive passively from an objective reality there that impresses itself indelibly on the ductile substrate of consciousness. Rather, the mind is composing, is dreaming the world.
Mhm.
Fairly good book on this. It came out just last year. It's called Dreaming Reality, and I can't remember the two authors' names. I don't agree with all of the philosophical outworkings of it because it's actually quite a good and comprehensive text on this. So, but why so much of the early Christian contention with the pre-existing pagan culture, the Auseinandersetzung, between it was we have a true revelation. It is much more in keeping with the logos or ratio of reality than your mysteries.
Mhm.
The general tenor of it was in a sense contrary to this notion that you could go to special places and seek out special dreams and private revelations.
Mhm.
And it's curious, I mean, because what are visionary experiences? The book that became the final book of the canon, not everywhere until the early 5th century, but the book of Revelation, it's a series of visions, but I mean, you could describe it as a series of dreams, some of them rather
Mhm.
unpleasant, but yeah. Um, but it simply never actually entered. There was always something I think that was probably suspect about seeking truth in fancies, because it was very much believed in the ancient world that there are all sorts of spirits, all sorts of powers, all sorts of archons out there that can try to lead you astray. I don't think there would have been much trust in a
Mhm.
practice like this, or in the interpretation of dreams, that it would look like one of the, I don't know, magical or oracular practices of the circumambient pagan culture.
Mhm.
But beyond that, I don't have any more insight into it.
I have a growing sense that I have yet to actually talk with anybody about this, but from the research that or reading that I've been doing, I have a growing sense that after the Second Temple and the loss of holy wisdom as a not a ruling figure, as an informing figure or a presence.
Well, yeah. I mean, in the wisdom literature, the figure of Chokmah or Sophia in the Septuagint,
Yeah.
is a real. I mean, it's really there in the book, in Sirach, in the Book of Wisdom,
Hmm.
and you know, Second Temple Judaism is an extraordinarily diverse and rich reality, but it's the part of this history of Judaism that we seem to be least acquainted with, especially for Christians. And we've been raised with a kind of Hollywood cinematic view of Judaism, in which it was always just the religion of the prophets, and then it was always rabbinical or Judaism. So from before the Second Temple period and from after the fall of Jerusalem. And this created an impression that Judaism was sort of like Christianity without Jesus. It was just, Protestantism without Jesus. It was not.
Hmm.
But the reality is that for centuries, when in the time of Christ, for more than 3 centuries already, there had been this ready and constant intermingling of influences. The Jewish nation, in the ancient sense, the people spread out throughout the diaspora and living in other lands and in the Holy Land, Persian, but also Persian Hellenistic, and so the figure of Sophia or of Chokmah in many ways shows up here and there and is analogous or has analogs in the culture around it. But it's neither central nor marginal. Nothing's either absolutely central or marginal in the sense that we
Hmm.
think now. Today we can say this is Judaism, this is Christianity. And even then we're talking about a very, very diverse reality, obviously.
That's true. Yeah.
But that period, late antiquity, 3 centuries rather of Hellenism and huge influence of Persian thought. The Pharisees definitely were a faction that had absorbed a great deal of Persian thought. Anything went,
Yeah.
it was intellectual, spiritual openness. It was not, the ancient world was not
So
sealed into little cells of purity.
okay.
Judaism was special in insisting, the one God is not representable. This God of Israel is truly. But even then, that kind of monotheism was not alien to the pagans. There'd been a kind,
No.
and the Judaism, the Second Temple period, drew on the sort of the dream imagery of apocalyptic literature, drew from Persian well springs and colored with Hellenistic thought.
So I'm curious, maybe you can help me sort of clear the air a little bit on this. It's so interesting you said the Persian influences, because dreaming for them and dreaming for Egyptians was as comfortable a concept or as normal as daylight waking, and it was a constant ongoing influx with the gods, with the angels, spirits of places, and so on. But that seems to have
Well, with the Persians,
not
better to say angels, because this, but yes, or
Well,
whatever you want to
yes,
call them. Yes.
agreed. But not so for the Hebrews. Here's been my working theory. With the Second Temple,
Well,
there was a loss of
I
that.
mean, Hebrews is kind of an anachronistic term here. By the time
Okay.
of the Persian suzerainty, in the wake
Okay.
of the fall of Babylon, and in the wake, and in the Hellenistic era, Judaism was influenced by all of those things. I mean, apocalyptic, it's hard to draw a real distinction between uh, the literature of visionary experiences and the literature of dreams. I mean, what's going on in the Book of Enoch or in the Book of
Hmm.
Jubilees? Well, you could say that these are straightforward narratives. They're not really vision narratives, or you could call it dream literature. I mean, something is being revealed in a state of consciousness, in a
Hmm.
series of tableaux. That's not what you're going to see walking down a country lane in Judea, right,
Right.
at the time. So I think it was, in that sense, part of the early Jewish and part of the early Christian imaginary, if you want.
Mhm.
But putting it in the world, you have to make this, is that the legitimacy or the authority of such things would be predicated upon it being a deliverance of God
Mhm.
in a sort of prophetic form, and that becomes more dubious or more suspect, I imagine, if it becomes,
Mhm.
Aunt Miriam had this dream,
Right.
and
And we get in trouble.
whereas a
Right.
pagan would, say, I'm ill, go and sleep in the temple of Asclepius and hope for a
Mhm.
dream from the god, and with that dream will come a blessing and perhaps healing. But you also have in the New Testament people waiting for the angel to stir the waters, waiting there for a divine visitation. And what is
Mhm.
that if not a sort of waiting upon a dream
Right.
state or a vision or a revelation? So I don't think we have to make hard and fast distinctions here. It's just the language in which these things would be discussed would vary by minute but real degrees from culture to
Mhm.
culture, or from cultural, from one cultural congelation to another,
Right.
but they were all intermingling, interfusing. And again,
Uh-huh.
I don't think making a hard and fast division between dream and vision is something we should do. I think these are two ways of talking about the same realm of imaginal
And there
mediation.
so there I'd be curious to ask what you think, because that's my contention, is that the imaginal or the perilous realm, as Tolkien would call it, or perhaps the realm of Fae or Fairy, it's all the same location,
Yeah.
realm, place thing, and it's
Or,
something that our
or,
imaginations dip into or have access to, something we
or
break
many
or breach.
overlapping locations. I'm willing to
Mhm.
make it a bit of a multiverse there. Yeah.
Agree. You did mention the multiverse, or Mike Sauter mentioned it in the Regeneration podcast, and I'm very interested in that. That's going to be a whole nother conversation, I suppose. If we would just come back to the idea of layering and like you said, the multiverse, could you continue down that as it relates to the imagination, especially as a truth-bearing faculty? And this is
Okay.
something that is not, I don't see, discussed enough. And I'm a proponent of, we need to heal storytellers and heal the
Yeah.
imagination, especially if you're trying to write fiction, because you're playing and with this tool in waking life, or tool or aspect or organ in waking life. And so nourishing it or building appropriate habits or healthy habits of soul and mind and body and all it's all an important thing for healthy functioning human, but also a storyteller.
Well, now, of course, when we use a term like multiverse, we don't want to do sort of make a new age conflation of what we're talking about and say, well,
Right.
you see it all in quantum physics. I mean, Everettian multiverse is a different matter altogether. It has to do with, decoherent states of quantum realities, and, whether everything that could be, as Richard Feynman said, everything that can happen does happen. But on this matter, I do think we walk in several worlds at once, and I believe that it's true that the world of waking consciousness is itself a world that is the poetic, or maybe epic, maybe lyric, but nonetheless poetic creation of consciousness. It's not something that I don't mean it emerges from my individual psychology alone, as if I could just, without any difficulty, make it disappear. Although my experience of it can obviously be altered by contemplative techniques, or if I use psychedelics or something like that. And those states I don't, are not, as far as I know. I won't say how far I know, but I went to high school in a different era than But I'll say this, is that those aren't just experiences of confusion. They can be experiences of the contraction or annihilation of the ego, but they also can be experiences of a reality that's every bit as concrete and demands every bit as much attention as what we take to be day-to-day existence. And as I mentioned, Owen Barfield, that book, Saving the Appearances, is, I think, something with it actually I've only come to know in the past 10 years. I didn't read a lot of Barfield at all earlier.
Mm-hmm.
It was I actually only started reading him when someone accused me of getting ideas from him that I didn't acknowledge. And I thought, well, I know that didn't happen, but if someone thinks that that's possible, means there must be something there that I would agree with at a profound level, and there is. I think that we inhabit these worlds simultaneously. Sorry, I've been married to an English woman for 40 years, and our habits of
I'm
speech.
from Australia, so I can never keep them straight.
All right. Well, there you have it. I would never have guessed from your accent. So anyway, that I think that the general belief about dreams in most of the ancient world and in both East and West, perhaps in a very pronounced and explicit way in East, was not that dreams were entering the spirit, but that the spirit was departing and not going on a journey. So that every dream was a journey into a place. It might not be a place that you particularly needed to go, but it was going somewhere,
Mm-hmm. And I suspect that you can hijack it. You can
Oh, yeah.
miss the point of the experience.
Sure.
Sometimes you can actually be receptive and learn from it. I think your point about the Red King it's the way that I make sense of, how do you say, our conscious participation with how the world is or how creation is. When you get the quantum physicists who say things like, well, perceived reality is not just generated, it's sort of phase locked by your conscious engagement with it. And like you just said, well, I can't just reinvent everything. So therefore, there's a red dream situation where there's a shared dream with some greater being within which we're working on this thing together, going through this together.
Or when I was in Australia last, actually, I was can't remember what his tribal background was, but a fellow of Aboriginal extraction. He said, well, so yeah, this translation of the dreaming isn't strictly accurate. I mean, sort of Alcharinga is a misheard phrase from one dialect, but most Aboriginal culture has adopted it as a legitimate way of expressing the spiritual universe of Aboriginal thought. And he just said, and think about this world. We're dreaming within a greater dreaming, and the greater dreaming, we can't alter it at will, but our dreams are part of it, and they can go into aspects of it. They can find doorways in it that lead to some unexpected and rather fantastic places. And of course, also the imagination does that when it creates, when you write a book. I mean, as I say, I started that novel, Kenogaia, as a way of getting out of a depression, because by doing it, my mind was, I thought, really journeying. And I journeyed into a world that had a logic to it. It had a dream logic in many ways, because there are ways in which the distinction between the scientific and the magical, or between the spiritual and the concrete, are correlated in a way that's very different from the world we think we know day to day. But what was interesting to me, and it's always been the case whenever writing anything, writing fiction especially, is that sometimes you feel like you're happening upon something whose laws you're only discovering. You're not inventing them, making them up. And definitely that world, Kenogaia, became for me a world where I say, oh, yes, of course.
And
I mean, in a sense,
so...
it was trying to start from a fairly conventional, I take two fairly stock characters, a 13-year-old boy and a girl. The boy is sort of bookish and doesn't pretend to be a hero, but he's brave because, and then there's the brave, plucky, adventurous girl who keeps him in line, who's the more commonsensical. Well, these are kind of, I don't know, sort of stock fantastic characters. You find them in varying guises, but in a recognizable way in many different kinds of fantasy. I just wanted to put them together in a different kind of world, to see what happened when they entered this world, which in a sense was also inspired, as you know, by the Hymn of the Pearl, the Gnostic text from the Acts of the Apostle Thomas in India. And it's loosely, that's the narrative structure that loosely tells the story of the third of the three companions, but also tells the story of them as well. Because what's interesting about the Hymn of the Pearl is that the saved and the Savior are kind of one and the same figure in that hymn. It's both one who goes to rescue, to retrieve the pearl of great price that's been lost in the foreign realm of Egypt, but also then is the image of the saved soul who has to be wakened from forgetfulness. Yes. Anyway, if I go on, I might give too much away
No,
about the
yeah,
book.
agreed. Well, unable to get to everything I'd love to discuss. Can we take a brief sidebar about Gnosticism, since the subtitle is a Gnostic fairy tale? But then I do want to come back to dragons, largely because I suspect dragons are not denizens, seraphic beings, perhaps, of varying degrees in the perilous realm, and to try to find them anywhere else is problematic.
Seraphic, but also fallen seraphs in some cases.
All of that.
Yeah.
Well, can we briefly, for Gnosticism, for those who have no sense of it, my loose understanding or sense of it is that it was a discipline of how would I put this? And then you can correct me. It was a discipline of spiritual engagement that stresses the individual's conscious and attentive, interior spiritual ascent, I suppose, into the divine, and then they just didn't know when to stop, or they completely
Yeah, I
dismissed, for
mean,
example, the
I
incarnate.
would not put it that way. No, I wouldn't describe
Okay.
it as a discipline. But then again, I don't really use the word Gnosticism as a coherent category. I use it
Right.
just as out of intellectual laziness because we don't have another way of talking. At one
Okay.
time, I mean, this is an idea that's gone through. There were these schools of Christian or para-Christian belief and devotion, and they came out of the Christian world. There used to be an attempt to say, "Wow, it was the Christian gnosis came from an earlier pre-existing Jewish or pagan tradition." And while there are analogies there are analogies in medieval Kabbalah and Lurianic Kabbalah and the other schools, but only analogies. And then in the late 18th century, these schools that had been identified at that time only by Christian texts seeking to refute them, Irenaeus and Hippolytus, Irenaeus especially. We didn't know much about them. There were certain books that still existed, certain texts, but it wasn't really till the 20th century that we discovered, say, at Nag Hammadi, a real treasure trove of these. And what they did was they confirmed, in one sense, the picture of these sects that had come down to us from Irenaeus. But they also made us more aware of the diversity. What I would say, what we call Gnosticism loosely, and the characteristics that we ascribe to it, which were real enough for certain styles of Valentinian or Sethian Gnosticism at the time, were schools of thought that drew upon language that you also find in the Gospel of John and in the letters of Paul and in apocalyptic literature like Enoch, and took it in a very specific direction in which the sort of Pauline or Johannine way of understanding Christ as someone who's overthrowing the malign powers, the malign angelic powers, the archons or the venemis, the thing, a whole spiritual world of not exactly evil or malevolent quite often, sometimes just incompetent or fallen or misguided. I mean, in the Valentinian system, the cosmic rulers, when they discover who the true God is, are willing to convert, So it's not, but we think of it as a dualism, speaking, and this world, the world of flesh and body is the work of a lesser demiurge that imprisons the spark of spirit, whatever it is, however, whether it's something that's real in all human beings, which most of these schools apparently thought it wasn't, that there was an elite. And instead of the metaphysics or mysticism of later Christian tradition about participation and ascent and deification in Christ and ascent through the heavens, which in the early church was meant quite literally. I mean, you have to understand that the division between the spiritual and the cosmic was not what it is for us now. So for Paul, Christ ascending on high was both a spiritual, but also in a sense, a sort of spatial ascent through the spheres of the powers of the air and the powers of the spheres to the true throne of God. But more importantly, it's God redeeming his creation. You see that in Romans 8. At the same time, there is a profoundly dualistic language used throughout the New Testament in Paul. I mean, when Paul in 1 Corinthians chapter 15 is anxious to say that the body of the resurrection is not a body of flesh and blood. I know that's not what later tradition made of him, but he says it quite explicitly. Flesh and blood cannot inherit the kingdom of heaven. Therefore, it's a spiritual body. It's made from pneuma, spirit, which is not just, like the Cartesian soul, disembodied res cogitans, but rather it was a kind of higher quintessence or element. So it's a different kind of body. So what we call the Gnostic sects, in some sense, are drawing on that dualistic imagery. But what they didn't have was the metaphysics or the mysticism I just described, except in some of them did, maybe. The Valentinian texts seem to say. But you get a metamythology in which now you have the long and frankly rather boring narratives at times about a real history of hypostases descending from above. So it was, if I were to draw an analogy today, I would say probably some of it resembled what you'd find in Scientology, or some of the odder, these sort of odder apocalyptic visionary cults that borrow from. But it was closer to the language of the New Testament in other ways than it was fashionable to admit in later years. And to this day, I've met people who say, well, I've read these Gnostic texts, and he's talking about like the archons that have to be overcome and all that. Because when the Gnostic texts are translated, they tend to be translated in that way in which those words are carried over. So archontes becomes archons. And these people are saying this to me are unaware that, of course, these are exactly the same terms that Paul uses, for instance, or the Gospel of John. It's just we're used to a translation in which archon becomes prince or ruler, the prince of this world, rather than the archon of this cosmos. So I find the very category of Gnosticism problematic, because when we adopt it, we reject, if you're raised in an Orthodox Christian background, they're rejecting not just the things that look genuinely like aberrations, these like the Barbello mythology and all that, which comes across as sort of like, bad fantasy writing, and the things that are there that are also found in the New Testament, because when we throw that out, we end up throwing away part of the New Testament without realizing it. And then, the whole intertestamental period, this whole discourse of how the fallen powers and angels work, or how the division of the nations in Deuteronomy was understood in the Second Temple period, especially among those who were reliant on the Septuagint, which has sort of the older version of Deuteronomy that isn't reflected in the later rabbinic Masoretic text, in which Elohim divides the nations among the different sons of El. And in that sense, Israel is Yahweh's special portion, and Yahweh might be understood then as a son of El, So the more polytheistic picture there, how they understood this in an age in which these are angelic rulers of the nations, some of whom do the will of God, but not defectively. Well, you see that in the book of Galatians, in fact. Why does Paul say that the law is defective? Because it was written and delivered by angels, and then it had to come through a human mediator. It wasn't written by God directly. And so these intermediate powers, they're not evil, but they're not perfectly competent. At the end of the day, though, there's an affirmation of the ultimate goodness of creation in Christian tradition that really is absent from most of what we call Gnosticism. Mm-hmm. There is a love of this world there too, in which, there's suffering and pain and death, but still raccoons are good, squirrels are good, a good cup of coffee or a good glass of wine is good. Yeah. That goodness will be redeemed cosmically,
This is something your book does.
Earth. Yeah.
This is something I loved about your book, was the world that we're introduced to, even though it's in a state of horrible oppression, it is still a stunningly beautiful world. I remember getting to the end and feeling this it was a thrilling sense of relief. And there was a joy at having not just endured the whole adventure and just
don't give away the denouement. Don't give it away.
I'm not giving anything away. Just the sense of joy and relief that the end brought about. And I wondered, do you feel that this story is not merely a Gnostic side quest or an effort for you to have fun with fiction? Does this map onto your sense of how you see the world, or how you see creation?
Yeah. Now, obviously, there's an allegory, not in the malign sense of just, one-to-one correspondence, but it's a world that's an image of fallenness and of Maya, illusion in the the
Vedic.
Advaitin understanding of that word. But what's interesting about that word, here's a sidebar for you, is that the word Maya, we normally in the West are familiar only with the sort of understanding of Vedanta that came into this country by way of the Ramakrishna tradition through Vivekananda and Prabhavananda and others. So we've all think of Maya as just meaning illusion. And in a sense, that and it is true that in the sort of the Advaita tradition of Vedanta, of Adi Shankaracharya, it very much has that, but understand it also means creation. It's the same Indo-European root as magia, magic, but also
Oh,
just means a creative power. Maya is not a purely opprobrious term originally in the Sanskrit. And so it has that duality to it. Maya is both the good divine power of creation and also, in another way, the malign power of the illusion we create whenever we see reality as separate from God. That's what it is for Shankar, is that whenever we see this world as something separate unto itself, like a mechanical artifact standing outside of the true God, we suffer illusion in there, and that's, the Maya that in the opprobrious sense. To me, that's very important. I mean, that again, I don't want to give
what a
anything
great
away about the
definition.
book,
Thank you.
but there is a magical figure. Let's put it that way. In that sense, a sorcerer that you might call him in the book, who's of crucial importance and who sort of spans the divide between the higher world liberated from illusion for the most part and the lower.
Is it fair to say that then the Gnostics would look at or take the Maya sense of all of this physical things, whatever these obscure the revelation or the truth or the presence of God, whereas the Christian take would be it doesn't obscure, it reveals, but just don't get hung up on it or don't.
Well, no, both. I mean, I think if you look at Paul and you look at John, it's both. I mean, Paul says in Romans 1, you can see, and I think he was very familiar with the Book of Wisdom, because I think both chapter 1 and chapter 5 give you very condensed portions of the Book of Wisdom. Chapter 5, when he talks about sin and death entering the world through one man, I think that's almost a direct citation from the Book of Wisdom, but also that chapter 1, when he talks about the evidence of God in the structure of creation, it's from wisdom. So chapter 13, my mind is, I don't know. Anyway,
I'm afraid I'm
it's
not
been a
that
while
good.
since I've read the Book of Wisdom. So, but also for Paul, of course, the flesh and the blood and the reign of death also hides the glory. And so the glory, the full glory is yet to be revealed. He talks about creations, is suffering birth pangs, really, waiting for this glory to be revealed when the glory will fill all things. And this, of course, is the biblical picture of salvation. It's the transfiguration of all of the cosmos, of all creatures. It's not like the picture that you get from Thomas Aquinas, just the resurrected humanity and the rest of creation destroyed, which is not Christian. I mean, that's not biblical, at least. I mean, I'm not blaming Thomas for that. It's very much of his time, but it's simply not biblical. And if there's some sort of general characteristic you'd have the Gnostics is, they revealed, beauty as there is in this world is an emulous imitation of a higher beauty in some forms of Gnosticism. In others, there's no sense of a higher world at all until it's revealed. And the alienation then is much more of an ontological one. That this world is in fact, this would make Thomists angry for me to say this, but that Thomistic eschatology, Aquinas' eschatology, is closer to the Gnostic in the malign sense than it is to the biblical picture.
There's a fun sidebar I'm not going to press. Only for the matter of time. I'd rather talk about dragons with you as a closing thought.
Is it a closing thought? Are we reaching the end? We might
Well,
be.
I mean, I don't want to, but we should probably wrap around about
Well,
an
let me
hour
let me say
time.
one thing though more
Yeah,
about
please.
this when it comes to narrative, kind of guys, is of course one is not confined to any particular genre in this approach, right? In this understanding. I mean, there are all sorts of literary works that would fall within a more sort of realist designation, in which nonetheless these experiences, visionary or oniric, transcendent, breaking through. One of my favorite, you say you came from Australia, well, the greatest Australian novelist ever, Patrick White, his masterpiece, Riders in the Chariot, his imagery drawn a great deal from the Merkaba mysticism of Judaism. But there, these narratives of the four main characters are very much in this world, but they share a vision of the transcendent, of the
Mhm.
chariot of God, and that you catch just out of the corner of your eye as a reader. Or a friend of mine, the novelist Sally Vickers, I once had a conversation that I recorded with her and said to her, what I love about her novels is that all the levels of reality that I believe in, the natural, but also the preternatural, or the realm of fairy, but the realm of the
Mhm.
angelic, the divine, they're all present together in one experience of this world, and they show through without breaking the continuum of the story. Although there are moments of things that can't be can't be explained away naturalistically, but nonetheless are not huge violations of. It's not a Deus ex machina, sort of
Mhm.
well, don't know what to do here, so let me toss in an angel. It's not that at all. It's I find that a very fulfilling sort of experience of fiction. But then also you can have the fairy tales, or the Alice novels, the fantastic dream novels, or that Middle European tradition I mentioned, in which the
Mhm.
borders of the real are always dissolving, and yet have a kind of dream logic to them that isn't merely a succession of one damned thing after another. I think it was Saul Bellow at his Nobel Prize speech, said that, that there's the manifest world in which we play parts and wear masks, and we believe we are those parts. But in fact, there's something more real than that abides. That's the spirit.
Mhm.
And what the good novelist does is catch glimpses of the spirit through the masks. And because, of course, Saul Bellow was not a. It's not like Philip Roth. He wasn't a materialist. So he was kind of influenced by Barfield and by Rudolf Steiner. Anyway, I'm going off on one of my.
That's why I say I don't want to press. I've been studying Steiner for 3 or 4 years now,
I
and
find him
trying to.
an odd character, but it's like. But I get the feeling that the good things in him you can get in Barfield,
Mhm.
and without paying it. Anyway, didn't he write like something like 3,000 books? I mean, it's
Well,
sort of.
it's an ongoing, yeah,
Yeah.
Silmarillion of stuff. Goodness.
We're going to talk about dragons.
Well, yeah. Let's close with
Dracontes.
that. I guess one to maybe ask: do you have a favorite dragon in literature? And then, what do you think about them in general? Because here's what I'm trying to
Uh,
accomplish. I'm trying to help rescue the concept from the general culture, where they are either all demonic or they mean, frankly, nothing at all. And I'm more interested in the layered, the nuanced,
well,
perhaps more shamanic, fairy tale,
yeah,
mythical.
it's a mysterious thing because they embody a great deal of terror, but also a great deal of sublimity. And there's a real difference that has to be made here. You have to distinguish first between Western and Eastern dragons, who are cousins, but whose history they represent rather different things, because the image of the dragon as it developed in Western culture, and with a sort of infernal quality, dwells beneath the earth in caverns, and guards a treasure, and feeds upon maidens, and is voracious and greedy, and yet and cold, and the dragon is a monster that has to be slain, or it's Fafnir in Siegfried in the ring cycle, who's used the ring to transform himself into a dragon so he can guard his treasure hoard and do nothing else.
Mhm.
That's all he. Although, frankly, Wagner's hero is pretty much a dragon too, but that's a different issue. It's
Mhm.
like really character of Siegfried's death. Siegfried's death is actually a moment of blessed relief for most of us. But then there's
Yeah.
sort of the Asian understanding of the dragon that represents warmth and vitality and wisdom. It's
Mhm.
still dangerous in some ways. It's sort of the ones that dwell in water. You don't want to tangle with the dragon,
Right.
but they also fly through the clouds, and they don't hoard treasure, and they're thought to be mysterious and full of wisdom. So, famously, what one anecdote about Confucius is that he met Lao Tzu, and came away saying he's like a dragon, meaning that marvelous, mysterious, maybe a little dangerous, but it's a high
Mhm.
compliment. And yeah, I think that duality is appropriate, because the notion of the dragon, the image, the dream image of a dragon, is one that sort of spans between the most bestial and terrifying and elemental experience of nature at its most pitiless, sort of like, the great Darwinian algorithm. The dragon is
Right.
the
Right.
predator of predators, the survivor of survivors. But also, it's magical, and there is a sense. I mean, the dragons generally in most of the literature can talk and think, and and there's a sense of something fallen there as well. And then, the eastern side, you get, again, that same sort of total picture, but now with a greater emphasis on what is, unfallen, or what is admirable and beautiful in the mystery of this
Mhm.
being. And I think you have to, if you're going to write about dragons, you should write both East and West. So, I don't know if I have a favorite. I mean, I like The Hobbit. I'm not as fond of The Lord of the Rings as I imagine you are. I have a mixed feeling about that, but I love The Hobbit.
Mhm.
Smaug is quite a
Yeah, yeah.
good dragon. I like the dragons of Ursula K. Le Guin, if I remember them from being young. But I suppose my favorite literary dragon might just be Lao Tzu.
I was putting together a little
Oh
research
no, I know.
project.
I'm completely wrong. I know exactly the answer to that. What am I thinking? In one of the two children's books I wrote with my son, this one called The Mystery of the Green Star. There are these novels for. There is a toy dragon who's half Western and half Eastern dragon.
Oh,
His I think his father was Welsh and his mother Chinese, or I may have that backwards. And he's a
mhm.
really sweet fellow, and he's a chef, and he has invented a whole new a Sino-Kumric cuisine, a fusion of Chinese and Welsh foods. And yeah, so he's my favorite dragon. Yeah.
I'm curious, as perhaps trying to create a closing question. It has having to do with why dragons exist, or why they're present at all in the, how do you say, not just the human psyche, the human imagination. Like you mentioned, the mere fact that they can converse. Some are fallen, some perhaps are not. Some reveal wonderful and good things. Some are teachers, and for me, that immediately tells me these are part of a more. These are creatures from the dreaming. These are creatures from this perilous, imaginal realm, and to root them purely in human imagination doesn't do them justice. But then also, then the question I'm struggling with, or trying, or wondering, is why are feathered, winged, communicating, or conversant, fire adjacent serpents? Why at all? Here's where I'm trying to go with this. I have
Yeah.
a sense that dragons are, in their best sense, the seraphic servants of holy wisdom, perhaps the seraphim themselves. That seems to be how they're presented in, I think, the Old Testament, or perhaps in Egyptian iconography, in which the Hebrews then
Or,
adopted their
or, or
flying, burning serpents.
yes. And Persian iconography of the Fravashi bird, I suppose, or of other winged lions, though, too. Well, yeah, I mean, this is part of I think actually, of course, we think of Judaism principally as an aniconic religion, but what one wasn't supposed to do was to create an image of, let's be pious here, Hashem, or however or Kyrios, however you want to get around using the tetragrammaton there. But the temple, had these terrific, terrifying cherubim and seraphim, and they're definitely a constant. We talked earlier about demons and genie, but there are other sort of liminal figures, aren't there, throughout the world that are somewhat more terrifying, and they're not quite the monsters of the Greek imagination, or they quite the daemones, the gods, but they have elements of the terrifying. And of course, this is something all ancient people would grant, that these higher presences, these, whether we call them angels or the archangels, the seraphim, the cherubim, they're actually quite terrifying.
Mhm.
Leonine, or many-winged, many-eyed, six wings. They soar aloft, borne on their pinions. I'm trying to remember what the translation is. One often hears in the Holy Liturgy, in the Eastern
Ezekiel?
Orthodox, the Divine Liturgy.
Mhm.
Ithia liturgia is what they call, Catholics would call going to Mass, but it's done on a much bigger dramaturgical scale, believe me. And that whole scene from Isaiah, of course, in the temple, they were crying, "Holy, holy, holy, Lord Sabaoth, heaven and earth are full of thy glory." I mean, and the whole house is full of smoke. It's just so the sense that the holy is not something we can tame, for one thing. That's something
Yeah.
Rudolf Otto brought out very well in Das Heilige, is that this mysterium tremendum, literally a mystery to be feared, to be
Mhm.
terrified by. and yet it's also the beauty and sublimity of holiness. It's the it's the beauty of God, the Yofi, the Yofi Yahweh, or Yofi Elohim. But it's also kavod, it's a kind of great weight, the glory, the weight of glory, which literally renders just what the word kavod in Hebrew means. And I think that's a true apprehension. I mean, or in English, every angel is terrifying, from the Duino elegies. And yeah, I think dragons represent that as well. And when this sort of holiness takes a fallen form, it can be understood as something titanic. It can be understood, say, as a creature like Typhon, whom Zeus had to conquer, or like Leviathan, whom Yahweh has to conquer, or Tiamat, whom Marduk conquered. I mean, it's all the same myth there. At the same time, again and again, we invest them with the power of language, the wisdom. You find kindlier dragons, older dragons, wiser dragons. So they're part of that ascending scale from the most terrifying and elemental, or even elemental sort of spiritual agencies, like the stichia that Paul mentions, the elements, all the way up to the angelic, and that all of this is part of how creation and the divine are joined together. And it's part of course, in Second Temple Judaism, the ascent of the heavens, the deification of mortals as they become angelic, and they can actually survive the experience of the angelic realm above the moon and in the heavens. And so our transfiguration into those things, I guess the dragon for a lot of us is sort of, in the Western tradition of understanding dragons, sort of the reverse image of what should become of us. They're the fallen angels, where we seek to be the ascending beasts that become angels. So I'm just
Yeah.
rambling. But
No,
you've
it's
had
so interesting.
for which I was not necessarily prepared. I think about dragons in the sense
Mhm.
that I'm a lover of the late antique world. And they
Mhm.
definitely talk about dragons. I mean, some of when they
Yep.
talk about dragons or giants, you find that actually bones have been discovered. So we're talking about dinosaurs, really, but that's interesting in itself. But uh, yeah, and my fascination with East Asian culture and South Asian culture, but East Asian culture, and the importance of the image of the dragon as a terrifying but wise mystery is
Mm.
one of the
It's so
profoundest.
intriguing.
It is indeed. It is indeed.
And how it shades into Hindu Nagas and then across Thailand, and how some of them they convert, they
Nagas,
become
and in
disciples of
different
the
ways,
Buddha.
and in different ways, Gandharvas and other sort of not the highest gods, and certainly not God himself, not Brahma Nirguna or Vishnu or Shiva, but
Mhm.
definitely these divine beings that also are sort of ambiguous, who are also winged creatures.
Mhm.
And of course, the Naga, you're right, the Naga king, the great Session Ananta, the great infinite Sesha, the Naga, the many-headed Naga upon whom Vishnu rests and sleeps upon the sea of milk when he
Yeah.
dreams this world. I love that imagery. I love the Vaishnav imagery of
I
God
think that
dreaming the world.
I think it's a perfect place to end, connecting dreams with dragons, because I do think it's perfectly appropriate to do so.